Imagine a narrow strip of water, right? Barely 21 miles wide at its absolute narrowest choke point.
Right. Practically a river in geopolitical terms.
Exactly. And we are looking at this geographical bottleneck where, a staggering 20% of the world's daily oil supply just physically passes through.
Yeah, plus a massive chunk of the global liquefied natural gas supply, too.
Right. So now imagine a single nation bordering that water, a nation that has been heavily sanctioned, completely economically isolated, and locked out of the global dollar system for years.
And they suddenly step up to a microphone.
Exactly. They announced they are now controlling the insurance and the passage through this exact choke point. But they aren't demanding tolls in US dollars.
No.
They aren't asking for British pounds or, using Western banking rails at all. They are demanding payment in a decentralized digital code that absolutely no superpower on Earth can freeze, seize, or just arbitrarily inflate.
It's wild. The geopolitical chessboard hasn't just been flipped over here. I mean, the very physics of how the pieces move on the board have been completely rewritten.
Today's show is an inspiring celebration of impossible ideas and the minds brave enough to chase them down. Finding passengers bold enough to embark on our good ship's journey is harder than most people think. So drop a very humane thumbs up right now to send a signal flare to drifting knowledge pirates like yourself. We know they're out there. Let's bring them home. We're keeping it lighthearted as usual, but we promise to never skimp on the intelligence. Now let's kick off this voyage with today's new revelations.
So to set a baseline for you, the listener, the mission of our deep dive today is to really analyze this highly intricate geopolitical and financial breakdown.
Yeah, pulled straight from our sources featuring analysis by a prominent Bitcoin expert, Simon Dixon.
Exactly. We are dissecting this newly alleged strategy by Iran to use Bitcoin to completely bypass global financial choke points. Specifically, we're talking about the SWIFT banking network and the maritime insurance behemoth Lloyd's of London.
Right, using it to ensure commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz.
But, before we get into the crazy mechanics of cryptographic escrows and sovereign hash rates, I do need to establish a firm ground rule for today.
Yeah, super important. Let's lay that out.
The sources we are analyzing today deal with highly charged international politics, state-level conflicts, and the evasion of U.S. and international sanctions. Neither of us sitting here at these microphones is taking a side.
Right, absolutely not.
We are not endorsing sanctions evasion, nor are we supporting or validating any political regime's actions, whether Western or Middle Eastern. Our mission today is strictly impartial and analytical. We are neutrally reporting and dissecting the mechanical, economic, and geopolitical ideas presented in the source material, just to understand the underlying logic.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really grasp the gravity of replacing a fiat-based maritime insurance contract with a cryptographic multi-signature protocol, we have to look at the legacy architecture it's aiming to bypass.
Yeah, you have to understand the old world to see why the new world is so disruptive.
Right. And the modern financial hegemony didn't just appear out of nowhere. It's built on hundreds of years of legacy plumbing, starting, well, quite literally, in a coffee house in London in the 1680s.
Oh, yeah. Edward Lloyd's coffee house, to be exact. I
Yeah.
mean, that is literally where the syndication of maritime risk was born.
Wait, a literal coffee house?
Literally. Wealthy oligarchs and merchants would just gather there. And if, a galleon was sailing to the New World, these individuals would pool their resources to underwrite the voyage.
Oh, so they'd literally write their names under the risk on a physical piece of paper.
Exactly, which is where the actual term underwriter comes from. They wrote under the risk.
That's fascinating.
And if you fast forward to today, that basic concept has centralized into Lloyd's of London, which still essentially dictates the terms of global maritime insurance.
So if a shipping company wants to move a massive cargo vessel through a high-risk zone, like the Strait of Hormuz, they absolutely require this insurance.
Right, because the underlying risk is just too astronomical for any single corporate balance sheet to absorb on its own.
But the insurance itself isn't the geopolitical weapon here, is it?
No, not the insurance itself.
The weapon is the unit of account required to purchase that insurance. I mean, the legacy system enforces this structural, unavoidable demand for Western fiat.
Exactly. Think about it. A shipping conglomerate based in, say, Asia can't walk into Lloyd's and pay their premiums in their local currency, and they certainly can't pay in physical commodities like oil or grain.
Right. They must acquire British pounds or US dollars.
which means every single time global trade happens, there is this synthetic bid underneath the dollar and the pound. It props them up.
And we really have to look at where those premiums go, right? Because these insurance syndicates are taking in billions of dollars in fiat premiums.
Oh, yeah, massive pools of capital. And they don't just leave that capital dormant in a vault. They have liability matching to worry about.
So they invest it.
Exactly. They take those massive dollar and pound reserves and funnel them directly into Western sovereign debt. U.S. treasuries, U.K. gilts.
As well as Western equities and corporate bonds, I'd imagine.
Precisely. So the very act of ensuring international trade operates as this massive, continuous capital injection right back into the Anglo-American financial ecosystem.
Wow. And all of this capital movement relies on the correspondent banking system, which is messaged via SWIFT.
Yes.
So, if I'm getting this right, the traditional financial system is essentially a global toll booth where the US and the UK not only collect the money, but also get to decide who is even allowed to drive on the road.
That's a great way to put it. But taking that analogy even further, they also own the underlying asphalt, right? And they can remotely disable your engine if they don't like where you're driving.
Because SWIFT isn't just a neutral messaging layer, it's deeply intertwined with Federal Reserve clearing.
It is entirely reliant on correspondent banking.
Mm-hmm.
Look, when a bank in Dubai wants to send dollars to a bank in London, physical cash isn't moving on an airplane.
Right, it's just ledger entries.
Exactly. They are adjusting balances in their Nostro and Vostro accounts, and those accounts ultimately clear through New York directly under the purview of the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury.
Which is the structural reality of the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency.
Yeah. So when the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, issues a sanction, they don't need to deploy the Navy to stop a transaction.
They just issue a piece of paper, a directive.
Right. Any bank globally that processes a dollar transaction for a sanctioned entity instantly risks losing their own correspondent banking relationships in New York.
Which would bankrupt them.
Overnight.
Yeah.
The threat of being locked out of dollar clearing is so existential that global banks effectively act as deputized enforcers for U.S. foreign policy.
Man, the friction this creates in the global economy is just staggering. Because the sources point out that when a nation is sanctioned, their demand for essential goods doesn't just magically vanish.
No, people still need to eat. The physical world still demands energy, food, industrial materials.
Right. What vanishes is their efficiency. We see these incredibly convoluted supply chains form in the shadows just to circumvent the dollar.
You see a total regression in economic efficiency. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sources outline how sanctioned entities are basically forced into physical barter.
Yeah.
Or they use highly inefficient intermediaries.
Like physically moving gold.
Yeah. They will move massive physical shipments of gold to jurisdictions like the United Arab Emirates. Or, more recently, they are utilizing over-the-counter desks in Hong Kong.
Ah, to swap the gold for crypto.
Exactly. They swap physical gold for Bitcoin, then trade that Bitcoin for Chinese yuan, simply because they need yuan to purchase industrial imports outside the purview of OFAC.
That sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It is. Middlemen extract massive rent at every single step of that process.
So if you're a sanctioned nation exporting crude oil, you're forced to sell it at a massive discount, right? Sometimes 30 or 40%, just to entice buyers to take on the geopolitical risk of moving it outside the standard rails.
Precisely. The legacy system operates by weaponizing this exact friction.
Which is the exact catalyst for the strategy outlined in our source material. Because if the old system relies on controlling the currency to enforce the rules, the banks, SWIFT, the clearinghouses, what happens when a sanctioned country adopts a currency with no central authority?
And no reliance on the correspondent banking system at all.
Right. This brings us to the core thesis of the breakdown. Iran has allegedly launched a digital platform, establishing a governing body claiming authority over transit through the Strait of Hormuz.
And they're offering their own maritime transit insurance.
But completely sidestepping Lloyd's of London and the dollar, they are demanding the insurance premium in Bitcoin.
Yeah. And the structural shift here goes far, far beyond merely changing the unit of account on an invoice. It actually alters the fundamental architecture of an insurance contract.
How so?
Well, under the centuries-old Lloyd's model, a shipping company pays a fiat premium up front. That capital is gone. It's a sunk operational cost. The insurer holds the capital, and the shipping company basically trusts the legal system of the UK to enforce a payout if something goes wrong.
Right. You're trusting a British court.
Exactly. But the proposed Bitcoin model utilizes a multi-signature or multi-sig transaction. This turns the entire concept of an insurance premium into a conditional cryptographic escrow.
Okay, let's really pull the engine apart on how this multi-sig actually functions in a maritime context, because it sounds like it completely eliminates the need for a legacy underwriter holding a massive pool of capital.
It does. So in a standard Bitcoin transaction, you have one private key signing a transaction to broadcast it to the network, right?
Right, just one signature needed.
But a multi-sig allows for highly complex programmable conditions, like a 2 of 3 setup.
Okay, what does 2 of 3 mean, practically?
In a 2 of 3 arrangement, a digital vault is created on the blockchain that requires 2 out of 3 designated private keys to authorize the movement of the funds.
Okay, so who holds the keys in this shipping scenario?
The shipping company controls key number 1. Iran, acting as the guarantor of safe passage, controls key number 2. And the third key is held by a decentralized neutral mediator, or even an automated oracle agreed upon by both parties beforehand.
So a shipping conglomerate funds the vault with the required Bitcoin. But the crucial detail here is that the payment hasn't actually settled to the insurer yet, right?
Exactly. The capital is locked in mathematical stasis. Iran doesn't actually have the funds yet. They simply guarantee the passage.
Oh, wow. So if the vessel transits the Strait safely and docks at its destination, both the shipping company and Iran cryptographically sign the transaction, releasing the Bitcoin to Iran.
You got it. The payment itself becomes the insurance.
That's crazy. And if there is an interdiction or the ship doesn't arrive safely?
Then the shipping company appeals to the mediator with the third key. If the mediator verifies the failure of the transit, the mediator and the shipping company sign the transaction together, refunding the Bitcoin straight back to the shipping company.
So it is completely trust minimized. You are replacing reliance on the High Court of Justice in London with reliance on a decentralized consensus mechanism.
Exactly. But the oracle problem here is fascinating. How does the mediator actually know what happened in the physical world?
Right. How does the blockchain know a ship sank?
Well, you could theoretically tie this to AIS, the automatic identification system transponders on the vessels.
Oh, that makes sense. So if the vessel's AIS pings from the destination port, a smart contract could just automatically execute the signature.
Exactly. That is the technological frontier of these mechanisms,
Yeah.
tying physical world data directly to cryptographic execution.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and I'm sure the listener is wondering this too. Why Bitcoin?
The network choice.
Yeah. Why not just use a dollar-pegged stablecoin, which would totally eliminate the price volatility of the premium? Or why not use another crypto network that's specifically designed for complex smart contracts?
The sources are highly explicit about this distinction, actually. It all comes down to base layer decentralization.
Okay, break that down.
If you attempt to execute this strategy using a stablecoin, like Tether or USDC, you haven't actually escaped the legacy system at all.
Because they're backed by dollars in a real bank.
Exactly. Stablecoins are issued by centralized corporations holding fiat reserves in legacy banks. The smart contracts governing those tokens have administrative functions.
Wait, really? Like a backdoor?
Basically, law enforcement, or OFAC, can literally send a subpoena to the issuer, and the issuer can trigger a freeze function in the token's contract, instantly freezing the assets in the specific wallet address.
Oh, wow. So a stable coin still has a throat to choke. The geopolitical vulnerability remains totally intact.
100%.
What about other decentralized finance networks? The source is specifically called out Arbitrum, right? Yeah, Arbitrum is a massive Layer 2 scaling solution. But the sources point out the architectural reality of its governance. When a major DeFi hack occurred on their network, the foundation backing the protocol, which is heavily funded by venture capital, by the way, was able to coordinate with validators to essentially pause or intervene in the network.
To freeze the exploited assets.
Exactly. Whenever you have a central foundation or a known group of developers with administrative keys or a centralized sequencer, you have a vulnerability to state coercion.
You essentially have a digital boardroom with an emergency brake, which means a state actor can just kick down the door of that boardroom.
Right. And Bitcoin's architecture is completely orthogonal to this. There is no foundation. There are no venture capital backers who hold a controlling stake of the tokens.
There's no CEO to subpoena.
No admin key whatsoever. The network is secured by tens of thousands of independent nodes running an open source protocol backed by a massive globally distributed wall of encrypted energy. You literally can't subpoena math.
So, by utilizing the Bitcoin base layer for this multi-sig contract, an entity completely circumvents the legal, financial, and jurisdictional reach of Western hegemony in one fell swoop.
Yeah. They are shifting the enforcement layer of global trade from the threat of military or financial reprisal to the deterministic execution of cryptography.
But merely demanding Bitcoin as a toll for a choke point, that's a passive strategy. The sources dive much deeper into Iran's macroeconomic playbook. They aren't just trying to extract Bitcoin from passing traffic.
No, they are actively working to dominate the production of it. They are operating as a sovereign hash rate superpower.
Right. So what does this all mean? The sources detail that Iran is already heavily integrated into sovereign-level Bitcoin mining, and they're holding the generated asset directly on their national balance sheet.
Yes. And to understand the geopolitical leverage of this, we have to examine the raw physics of mining.
Mining requires vast amounts of cheap energy.
Exactly. Mining is the process of utilizing specialized hardware ASICs to compute trillions of cryptographic hashes per second to secure the network. The inputs are hardware and electricity. The output is a globally liquid, censorship-resistant asset.
So the profitability of that operation is almost entirely dictated by your energy costs. It's basically an energy arbitrage game.
Precisely. And this is where the macroeconomic context of the sources becomes crucial. The sources allege that through various international agreements, Iran has the capacity for civilian nuclear power generation.
And nuclear power is a baseload energy source.
Right. It is incredibly efficient, but it is rigid. A nuclear reactor operates optimally when it runs at near 100% capacity continuously. But human energy demand is not continuous. It fluctuates wildly between night and day, summer and winter.
So you have massive amounts of stranded or wasted energy during off-peak hours because you can't just easily spin down a nuclear reactor the way you can like a natural gas peaker plant.
Exactly. And this is the holy grail for Bitcoin mining. Miners act as an infinitely flexible load. They can sit right next to the reactor, absorb all that excess baseload power, and instantly power down if the civilian grid actually requires the energy.
Oh, wow. It monetizes stranded energy with near-perfect efficiency. Are they basically turning energy directly into untraceable digital gold?
That's exactly what they're doing. But compare this dynamic to a Bitcoin mining operation in the United States, say out in West Texas. An American miner is subject to the volatility of a deregulated energy grid, inflation, and tense capital expenditures. They might be fighting tooth and nail just to break even.
But if a nation-state like Iran is utilizing highly subsidized, state-controlled nuclear baseload to power their ASICs, their cost of production is structurally asymmetrical to Western miners.
It is a profound arbitrage. They are taking raw, stranded nuclear energy and transmuting it directly into digital gold. And they are doing this while operating under severe trade deficits and crippling economic sanctions.
The sources used the oil markets to illustrate this energy asymmetry, didn't they?
Yeah, the expert in the source utilizes the lifting costs of crude. Look at Saudi Arabia. They can extract a barrel of oil from the ground for incredibly low figures, often cited between $2 and $10.
Right.
Conversely, major U.S. shale producers, or massive conglomerates like Chevron and Exxon, require the global market price of oil to remain significantly higher, often above $40 or $50, just to sustain profitability and cover their massive capital expenditures.
So the Middle East already possesses this staggering structural advantage in legacy energy markets. What happens when they pivot that exact same energy asymmetry toward the production of a mathematically capped digital asset?
They can outmine Western nations simply because their energy floor is so much lower.
So if Iran combines a sovereign nuclear mining operation with a maritime insurance industry that constantly pools Bitcoin premiums, they are essentially architecting a massive sovereign wealth fund.
A war chest, really. One that sits entirely outside the correspondent banking system and is totally immune to OFAC sanctions.
But this inevitably leads to the central question of enforcement. I mean, the listener is naturally going to ask, how does the United States Treasury respond to this? Why don't they just confiscate the Bitcoin? Can they just seize or ban it?
Well, the legacy mindset assumes that if a government wants an asset, they just write a law and take it. But the source material makes a vital distinction here regarding the nature of custody. It is the difference between custodial holdings and self-custody.
Okay, let's break that down. Custodial first.
If an entity, even a sovereign wealth fund, holds their Bitcoin custodially, meaning they trust a third party to manage their private keys, they are fully vulnerable. If the asset sits on a centralized exchange like Coinbase, or if it is wrapped into a traditional financial vehicle like a BlackRock ETF, The U.S. government retains absolute authority.
They can just issue a court order.
Exactly. They issue a court order to the regulated institution, and the institution will hand over the assets because they are legally bound entities operating within that jurisdiction. The confiscation mechanism is identical to seizing a traditional bank account.
But the architecture of self-custody breaks this paradigm entirely, right?
Totally breaks it. If a sovereign state secures their own private cryptographic keys, perhaps utilizing a multi-signature quorum of hardware wallets that are physically distributed across secure military installations, confiscation becomes a mathematical impossibility.
Because a hardware wallet secures the private key using elliptical curve cryptography. The U.S. military could theoretically seize the physical device, but without the PIN and the seed phrase, the device is mathematically inert. It's just a piece of plastic.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is that the sources bring up a brilliant historical parallel to illustrate the limitation of the state against self-custody. They reference 1933 and Executive Order 6102.
Oh, right, when they banned gold.
Yes. In the depths of the Great Depression, the U.S. government essentially made the private hoarding of gold bullion and certificates illegal. They commanded citizens to surrender their physical gold to the Federal Reserve in exchange for roughly $20 an ounce.
But the context there is crucial, though. The U.S. was operating under a gold standard. The Federal Reserve Act required the central bank to hold physical gold to back a percentage of the paper currency they were issuing.
Right, the state was desperate to expand the monetary supply to combat deflation, but they were constrained by their gold reserves. The confiscation was a mechanical necessity to devalue the dollar.
And physical gold is heavy, it's difficult to transport, and it's impossible to hide at scale without vast logistical footprints. The state could physically seize it.
But the expert notes that Bitcoin lacks this convertibility requirement for the state. The Treasury doesn't need to hoard Bitcoin to back the dollar. Furthermore, digital confiscation of self-custodied keys is impossible without resorting to literal physical coercion of the individuals holding the keys.
Basically the wrench attack.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But just because they can't mathematically freeze the UTXOs on the blockchain doesn't mean the Treasury is powerless. They shift their strategy from direct confiscation to regulatory quarantine. They weaponize the transparency of the public ledger against the actors.
Right, because the Bitcoin blockchain is a transparent, immutable ledger. Every transaction is publicly verifiable. So the state utilizes heuristic analysis, partnering with blockchain surveillance firms like Chainalysis to identify and cluster addresses.
Yes. When they determine that a specific cluster of addresses is controlled by a sanctioned entity, OFAC places those addresses on a blacklist.
They poison the well. The Bitcoin isn't actually frozen. It can still move freely across the decentralized network to other self-custodied wallets.
Right.
But the moment those specific UTXOs attempt to interact with the legacy financial system, say, moving to an exchange in Europe to be liquidated for fiat, the regulatory firewall kicks in.
The compliance software at the exchange instantly flags the blacklisted UTXOs. Under intense regulatory frameworks like the Financial Action Task Force's Travel Rule and the Bank Secrecy Act, the exchange is legally obligated to freeze the account and file a suspicious activity report, or SAR.
Because the executives of that exchange face criminal liability if they fail to comply. So the asset becomes effectively radioactive to regulated capital.
It is the ultimate collision of an unstoppable digital protocol and an immovable regulatory wall.
But the technological leapfrog doesn't stop there, does it? If the state relies on heuristic clustering to enforce the quarantine, the countermeasure is breaking the heuristic link. The sources discuss privacy tools, specifically pointing to protocols like CoinJoin.
Yeah, CoinJoin is a cryptographic privacy mechanism. It is entirely legal software that obfuscates the origin of funds.
Yeah.
The standard analogy is mixing dyed water in a pool, but a more accurate mechanical comparison is a highly complex corporate shell company restructuring.
Executed by a smart contract.
Executed simultaneously by thousands of participants through a smart contract, where the resulting assets are perfectly symmetrical and legally untraceable to their origins.
So it aggregates hundreds of inputs from different users, mixes them in a single massive transaction, and spits out hundreds of identical outputs. The mathematical link between the specific input and the specific output is permanently severed.
Exactly. The surveillance firms can see that funds went into the CoinJoin and funds came out, but they cannot definitively prove which user owns which output.
Wow. However, the regulatory response to this is pretty blunt force, right?
Very blunt. While a private citizen can utilize CoinJoin to protect their financial privacy from corporate surveillance, if a regulated bank or exchange receives a UTXO that has recently passed through a mixing protocol, their compliance departments generally reject it outright.
Because they can't verify where it came from.
They cannot cryptographically verify the source of wealth, so they default to assuming it is illicit just to protect their own banking licenses.
It is a massive game of geopolitical friction. But, to truly grasp why a sovereign nation like Iran would dedicate such immense resources to building an alternative financial infrastructure mining with nuclear baseload, deploying multi-sig insurance contracts, navigating blockchain privacy tools we have, to look at the macro weapon they're trying to disarm.
We have to look at how fiat currencies operate as the ultimate tool of imperial control.
Right. The sources highlight this as the #1 tool of empire, the deployment of currency wars. Before kinetic warfare is ever considered, the economic hitmen arrive.
The modern imperial playbook doesn't rely on invading armies. It relies on destabilizing the central bank and the currency of the target nation.
Let's really break down the actual mechanics of a speculative attack on a sovereign currency, because it is terrifyingly effective. The standard playbook often begins with an international institution, like the IMF, stepping in during a period of economic weakness.
Yes, they offer a massive loan to stabilize the country, but the capital comes with severe structural adjustment requirements.
Strings attached.
Massive strings. The primary condition is almost always forcing the target nation to open their financial borders, allowing their local currency to be freely traded on the global foreign exchange, or FX markets. They force the nation to remove capital controls.
And once a smaller emerging market currency is exposed to the deep liquidity of Western capital markets, it is highly vulnerable to orchestrated short selling.
Unbelievably vulnerable. A massive Western investment bank, or a macro hedge fund, decides to essentially break the currency. They borrow vast sums of the target nation's local currency from global banks.
And then they just dump it.
They immediately dump that currency onto the open FX market, aggressively selling it in exchange for US dollars. This massive synthetic supply completely overwhelms the organic demand for the local currency, driving its value into the ground.
So to defend the currency peg and stop the hyperinflation, the target nation's central bank is forced to use their own foreign dollar reserves to buy up their local currency on the open market.
But a central bank of an emerging market has a finite amount of dollar reserves, whereas a coalition of Western investment banks has access to almost infinite leverage. The sources reference the historical operators of this strategy, the archetype being George Soros breaking the Bank of England in 1992.
Or operators like Scott Bent mentioned in the source.
Right. Eventually, the central bank's reserves are bled dry. They capitulate, let the currency free fall, and the hedge funds buy back the local currency for pennies on the dollar to repay their initial loan, pocketing billions in profit.
Imagine your life savings having in value overnight because of a trade made on a server in London. I mean, it's not just abstract economics, it's the weaponization of everyday survival.
And the devastation on the ground is absolute. The purchasing power of the average citizen's life savings is mathematically eviscerated in a matter of weeks. They can no longer afford imported food, medicine, or energy. It triggers rapid domestic unrest, hyperinflation, and political collapse.
We've seen this precise mechanism destroy the economies of Zimbabwe, Argentina, and Venezuela.
Even Turkey recently faced massive speculative pressure, forcing them into complex negotiations regarding their sovereign gold reserves just to stabilize the lira.
And once the local currency is destroyed, the nation is forced back to the IMF to take on even larger dollar-denominated loans to rebuild.
Because they cannot print US dollars, they must orient their entire economy toward exporting raw materials to the West just to service the debt on the loan. They become a permanent economic vassal state.
This is exactly why the adoption of a decentralized asset fundamentally changes the game theory of sovereign reserves. Because the Bitcoin network enforces a deterministic 21 million hard cap through a difficulty adjustment algorithm.
It entirely neutralizes the supply inflation vector of currency wars. You cannot short Bitcoin into the ground by forcing the protocol to print more of it.
The supply schedule is mathematically inelastic. There are only about 1 million Bitcoin left to be mined between now and the year 2140.
No central bank, no coalition of Wall Street hedge funds, and no military can arbitrarily dilute that supply. While highly capitalized actors can manipulate the short-term fiat trading price of the asset on centralized exchanges, they cannot debase the underlying ledger.
It is a profound shift in sovereign strategy. Iran can, and heavily does, inflate their own fiat currency, the rial, effectively taxing their own citizens via debasement. But by choosing to utilize Bitcoin for external maritime trade and sovereign reserves, they are willingly submitting to a strict, hard money standard on the international stage.
They are opting into a system of financial physics that they cannot bend, specifically because their adversaries cannot bend it either.
The sources draw a powerful parallel to the strategy currently being executed by El Salvador, don't they?
Yeah, El Salvador has a tragic history of brutal civil conflict heavily exacerbated by crushing IMF dollar-denominated debt. Their modern counter-strategy is profound in its simplicity. They are dollar-cost averaging into a hard asset. They are acquiring exactly one Bitcoin every single day.
They are accumulating a strictly scarce asset to dramatically increase their national purchasing power over a long time horizon, essentially attempting to mathematically outgrow the structural trap of the IMF. Okay, so we've dissected the micromechanics of multi-sig maritime insurance, the physical energy arbitrage of nuclear baseload mining, and the macro history of IMF currency wars. How do these distinct vectors synthesize into a new geopolitical map? If this strategy takes root, what does the emerging alternative global economy actually look like?
The source material outlines the architecture of a highly strategic emerging economic corridor that explicitly bypasses Western financial infrastructure. It is a tripolar power dynamic.
Okay, lay it out for us.
First, you have the United Arab Emirates serving as the massive physical hub for gold markets and a crucial logistical node for physical sanction circumvention.
So they handle the movement of physical bearer assets outside the digital banking rails.
Correct. Then you have Hong Kong operating as the deep financial plumbing. It provides the capital markets, the over-the-counter crypto desks, and the fiat off-ramps required to grease the wheels.
And finally, you have Iran.
Right, stepping into the corridor with vast reserves of cheap energy, raw materials, and this aggressive new Bitcoin settlement strategy.
And the gravitational center of this entire corridor, the ultimate customer absorbing all this energy and material, is China.
China is the industrial engine. They are the primary consumer of the region's energy. And crucially, we are already seeing the early stages of de-dollarization in these exact channels.
China is increasingly settling crude oil purchases from the Middle East, not in US dollars, but in petro-yuan, bypassing the correspondent banking system entirely.
But the sources make a critical observation about the future of this trade. It is moving past the legacy reliance on crude oil. The foundational commodities of the next century, the resources that will dictate global power during the AI and robotics revolution, are shifting.
Right. The strategic focus is shifting toward computational power and the energy required to sustain it.
The sources identify advanced semiconductor chips, heavily concentrated in Taiwan, and liquefied natural gas, or LNG, with massive reserves in Qatar as the critical commodities of the next decade.
Massive AI data centers require staggering amounts of constant baseload energy, which LNG provides, and the most advanced logic chips, which Taiwan produces.
This raises an important question. What happens to the global balance of power if the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, and Iran manage to truly normalize their relations, utilizing China's massive diplomatic weight and infrastructure investments as the bridge?
If that normalization solidifies economically, they effectively architect a closed-loop macroeconomic system that commands a massive percentage of global trade without ever interacting with a New York clearinghouse.
Exactly. You have China's unmatched manufacturing base and capital. You have the Middle East's staggeringly cheap energy and LNG. You have access to the advanced semiconductors required for the next technological leap. And now, through the utilization of physical gold and decentralized protocols like Bitcoin, you have neutral, permissionless settlement rails to facilitate all of it.
It is the absolute blueprint for a fully parallel global economy. And the sources provide one final, incredibly fascinating data point regarding how this parallel economy might begin to absorb capital. They point to the recent reopening and activity of the Iranian stock market.
Yes. The Iranian stock market operates as a highly internal, heavily restricted walled garden due to sanctions. However, the expert in the sources draws a compelling comparison between its current trajectory and the historical behavior of the Caracas Stock Exchange during Venezuela's economic collapse.
Wait, comparing it to Venezuela sounds incredibly bearish on the surface. If the Venezuelan economy completely collapsed into hyperinflation, why would replicating their stock market boom be viewed as a strategic maneuver for Iran's asset base?
Because you have to separate the real economy from nominal asset prices. When hyperinflation struck Venezuela, the nominal value of their stock market exploded upward, seeing gains in the thousands of %. but it wasn't indicative of genuine corporate growth or economic health.
It was a desperate capital flight mechanism.
Exactly. Wealthy internal families, local institutions, and pension funds were trapped inside the collapsing currency. Their only defense was to aggressively bid up the prices of hard assets and local equities to park their wealth and outpace the devaluation of the bolivar. It operates as a life raft for local capital.
But how does a local inflation hedge translate into a geopolitical tool for Iran?
Because of the walled garden effect.
Yeah.
If Iran successfully integrates this heavily discounted, isolated equity market into the new alternative financial rails we've discussed, the China gold and Bitcoin settlement corridor, it fundamentally changes the dynamic.
It represents a massive block of previously inaccessible, deeply discounted economic value slowly cracking its doors open to non-Western capital.
If Russian or Chinese capital, utilizing Bitcoin rails to bypass OFAC, suddenly gains access to deeply suppressed Iranian industrial equities, it triggers a massive influx of liquidity outside the purview of the legacy system.
We've spent this deep dive exploring how lines of cryptographic code are being utilized to literally redraw the geopolitical lines on a map. But consider this. If sovereign nations are increasingly turning to mathematically enforced trust, utilizing multi-signature smart contracts and sovereign hash rates because they can no longer trust the highly weaponized international institutions, what happens to the global order when the foundational layer of world trade isn't backed by a superpower's military or a central bank's correspondent network, but by an open-source, decentralized ledger? It's a paradigm shift that goes far beyond maritime shipping lanes. It challenges the very definition of sovereign financial power in the 21st century. The outro music is by Rainbow, our resident 6 Android girl band from near-future Bavet, Cambodia. They are the undisputed baddest band in the universe, and today's song is called Vote Orange. All finished songs are performed live using the Abacus platform by the band's creator, Human Performance in the Age of AI, reclaiming your humanity from the algorithm. Be sure to share the playlist with someone who has the mental bandwidth to absorb these provocative ideas. Links are in the description below. Enjoy the music! Thanks for tuning in.
Companda con la cena, amada por me com, acompañan tarai, con me say. Doña Chow, chama mana jaga kata, doña ta mama mama taila beira, doña ta wada wada yai, doña sola nya dai, doña ta la yai, ala la bata bata, doña la la yai. Ala the bata bata, doña la mata bata chow. I'm a melody, get on the face. Like a sun, talk on my job, play on your side. You're not gonna my job, play up in life. Gonna some more market life. I just have on the side, like that's a loving life. Gonna not start just my job, put some of my way. 내가 너무 설레게 알록한 감독도 맘은 쏟는다니까 그래마다 다 바짝 그냥 와 go on the clock and the go 끝까지 섰으면